Every day, Sean Combs walks into federal court in a sweater and slacks and listens to testimony about his freak-offs and alleged criminal, violent behavior. And as he listens to this and is fighting for his life, there are people in court supporting him. On the first day of his trial, many of Combs' family members were there. His daughters and his mother, Janice Combs, she was also there. His sons were also in court. And there's one person who's been at every court appearance for Sean Combs, and he's also attending the trial each day. He's Combs' best friend, Charlucci Finney.
I'm a father of two daughters, right? So I wouldn't be here wearing this shirt if I've ever saw any one of my friends, especially him, hit a woman. And it would never happen in front of me. And I've never seen it, never heard it. And seeing it, yeah, it was a lot to take in, but I knew that wasn't him. It looked like, you know, like I was saying, drug-induced, high, or whatever you want to call it. But that's not the Sean that I know.
Now, Finney contends Combs and Cassie were just in a toxic relationship marked by domestic violence, not sex trafficking, and he called the freak-offs consensual.
Diddy just lost big in court, and this time it wasn't a minor detail or a procedural delay. This time it was Cassie, on the stand, under oath, telling the truth that had been buried for years. The courtroom wasn't ready. The media wasn't ready. And Diddy? He looked like he was watching everything he built shatter piece by piece, word by word. It started quietly. Cassie took the stand, steady, composed. But the second she opened her mouth, the silence turned electric. She didn't hold back. There were no euphemisms, no vague suggestions. She spoke in details, dates, places, emotions, names. And the jury?
Ventura officially broke up in 2018, but by this point, if you've been following this trial, you know how toxic and tumultuous this relationship was. It was on again, off again, officially ending in 2018, but for a period of time, Cassie was talking with Kid Cudi. Cassie testified at the start of the trial that her claims of abuse by Combs went on for years. She detailed about what went on during these so-called freak-offs. These are central to the government's case. Combs' trial is expected to last another month at least. He's charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty. Joining us now is former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Eastern and Southern District of New York, where this case is being tried, Barrett Berger. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here on Law and Crime. There's been a lot of talk about Sean Combs' drug use over the past couple of days. What stands out to you in that testimony?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually turned into a pretty central part of the prosecution's case. So the allegations that make the drug use particularly relevant are that this is one way that Combs exerted control over both Cassie Ventura and potentially other victims as well. We haven't heard from them yet. But part of the way that he was able to make Cassie compliant during these freak-offs, we learned this from her testimony, is through the use of drugs. So Cassie testified that for many of the freak-offs, she was high. She was given a number of different narcotics. We had other witnesses that came in and testified about seeing her, laying on a bed, appearing to be under the influence of some sort of drugs. So this was what we're seeing now is a pattern of Combs being able to, in some instances, control her through many different ways, but one of the central ways that we've heard testimony about is through these drugs.
How do you feel the government's been able to say that Cassie was more forced to take these drugs, as opposed to she lived as someone who is in kind of the spotlight? You live that mentality where there's drugs that's always around, showing that she was actually forced to take it, as opposed to something that she just did willingly.
They were locked in, frozen, like statues, because they knew what they were hearing wasn't just testimony, it was confession. It was survival. It was history unraveling in real time. Cassie described the very beginning, how Diddy approached her, how it all felt like a dream at first. The studios, the shows, the promises, how he offered her a life most people only imagine. But behind closed doors, it was never about music. It was never about love. It was about control, power, fear. She painted a picture that was hard to hear. The mood swings, the isolation, the constant need to ask for permission. She said Diddy dictated everything, from what she wore, to who she texted, to when she could sleep. And then came the punishments. Silent treatments, verbal abuse, threats that weren't just words.
She wanted access to this lifestyle. She wanted access to his power, to the fame, and so she did these things voluntarily. I think what the prosecutors have to show is that there was not only this huge power dynamic between the two of them, right? He is this, multi-million-dollar music magnate, and she is an aspiring singer who really wants to be in that orbit. There's an age dynamic. She was very young when they first started dating, but also this, elements of violence and control. So I don't think that they have to show that every time she took drugs, it was involuntary. As long as they can show that, there were certain instances where she didn't want to, or that Combs was particularly insistent on this, or that this was something that he was really pushing. So they do have to connect this to this pattern of coercion and control, but they don't have to necessarily say that every time she took drugs, it was totally against her will.
And, he of course, a larger than life figure, has endless amounts of money. So in some ways I could see someone saying it's not a surprise that he had just so many drugs in his home, as well as, some of the other, baby oil's been talked about at length in this case. But were you surprised by just how much it was talked about that apparently he was regularly using substances, that he himself was someone who partook in these drugs a lot, according to people who were around him?
Yeah, I think it's surprising for many of us to hear about how pervasive that was, and how much of a factor in their lifestyle this was. But, one thing that's interesting to me is it really goes to this idea of what kind of a network he had around him. He was certainly not able to get all these drugs on his own. He had assistants and guards and people that worked with him that were able to help him procure drugs on a regular basis. This is going to help the prosecutors go to one of, I think, the biggest hurdles that they're going to have to prove here, is the idea that this was an enterprise. Remember, one of the things they've charged is a racketeering conspiracy. In order for this to be racketeering, there has to be an enterprise. It can't just be one person doing this on his own. It's a little tricky when you only have one person sitting there in the defendant's chair, right? He's the only person charged right now.
Threats that had weight. And then she talked about the freak-offs. She said he had a name for them. Nights where she was drugged and made to entertain others. She testified that she didn't consent, that she didn't remember parts of it. She said Diddy kept recordings, that he used them to control her, remind her, humiliate her. She described a particular incident in 2013 where she woke up in a hotel bathroom, alone, bruised, and terrified. She said Diddy acted like nothing happened. She tried to run. In 2014, again in 2016. Each time, she said, he found her. Not directly, but through others. He'd send someone to check in. Or she'd get a random call reminding her she had signed NDAs. Or her accounts would be locked. She said she lived in fear, not of being alone, but of being found. The courtroom hung on every word. People leaned forward. Reporters stopped typing, just listening. The judge didn't interrupt once.
Powder, for example, drugs that you would assume are not legal, but then there's prescription drugs that he was able to get. And typically for folks that aren't music moguls, your doctor's not going to give you that amount of certain drugs. Cassie's testimony, from what we've heard from our reporter in the courtroom, it was incredibly raw, it was incredibly emotional. She's been described by many as the star witness in this case. What do you make of the decision to have her go? And I know she's 8.5 months pregnant, so her availability probably factors into this as well. But for her to go early in this case and kind of set the tone, as opposed to building up your case and then having her come in as somewhat of a grand finale at the end.
Yeah, I think this was probably a decision that was part strategic and part practical. I mean, when you have a witness that is pregnant, could theoretically give birth any day, you want to make sure that you get them in before they become unavailable. Let's be honest, it also doesn't hurt their case to have a witness that is pregnant. You could tell that the defense was a little bit more cautious with her. I think they treated her with a little bit more respect and probably went a little easier on her because of the fact that she's pregnant. It's not a great look to see defense counsel beating up on somebody who's 8.5 months pregnant. So there probably was some of just the practical, let's get this in before she becomes unavailable side to the decision. But also, when I was a prosecutor, we always you want to start strong and you want to end strong. Anything that's kind of boring, troublesome, you kind of want to bury in the middle of your case. For them, Cassie's a really important witness because she can speak to, this many years of what happened during this racketeering conspiracy. She was there, with Combs and a part of his life throughout, most of the charged time period. And she can speak to a lot of the, various racketeering incidents that have been charged, but she can also give a very good overview of what he was like as a person. She testifies about the abuse, she testifies about the coercion. Through her, they're able to show this video, the CNN video showing his abuse in the hotel room. So I think she was a really important witness. I really can't imagine.
The air in that room was thick because it wasn't just about what was said. It was about how it was said. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed this testimony in her mind for a decade. Cassie didn't cry much, only once, when she spoke about her parents. She said she lied to them for years, told them she was happy, told them she was busy. She broke down when she recalled how her mother once called and she couldn't pick up the phone because she was in a locked room crying. Then came the evidence. Emails, voicemails, screenshots of messages where Diddy apologized, blamed stress, asked for forgiveness, promised change. Then relapsed again. One voice message played in court sent chills. Diddy's voice, slurred, aggressive, calling her worthless, saying no one else would want her. That audio echoed through the room like a siren. She had photos too. A bruise on her arm, a busted lip, dates, times, even medical receipts. The defense objected, claimed the images were edited. The judge allowed them. Experts verified metadata. They were real.
For example, was found at Diddy's house in Miami. How do you as a prosecutor make sure that that really emotional testimony in the beginning still holds, where a couple days later, a couple witnesses later, we're talking about the drugs, and you want to make sure the jurors remember that pregnant woman in the beginning who was so innocent that she was taking these substances?
Yeah, that's always a challenge for prosecutors. And, not only is it hard to keep sort of that emotional high going, but remember, witnesses and evidence don't always come in to a case in chronological order. It's not always a linear description of first, then this happened, then, point A to point C. You kind of come in bits and pieces. You might have one witness who's only available to testify in a given week, so you have to call them then. So really, that's the prosecutor's job at closing argument. And we're going to see them have a huge job to put all of this together at the end of the case. And what they're going to do is try to bring the jurors back to Cassie's testimony. They'll quote from her testimony. They'll try to draw out and be like, remember when she talked about this? Remember how she sounded? So they'll have to do a good job trying to bring the jurors back to that moment. That is the challenge of having a witness like Cassie go first, is, you have a 5, 6, 7 week trial. By the end of it, are the jurors really remembering everything she says? She was such a compelling witness, and I think her testimony was so emotional. You said the word raw. I think that's a good description of it. I think the jurors will remember the effect that it had on them, even if they don't remember all the specifics of her testimony. And that's then going to be the prosecutor's job at closing to bring those back into the narrative.
I think for so many of us on the outside of the world of fame, like, you try to think of what it would be like if you were in those circles like Sean Combs, and then you hear about the drug use, the sex, and all of this. And then I think back to this jury, and it's like you have a social worker sitting on that jury, There's like a deli clerk sitting on that jury. What impact could just how exotic this lifestyle was have on people? Like, I think of my parents, if they were sitting on this jury, I mean, they would be blown away just understanding that any of this would be alleged to have happened in this man's life.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was a prosecutor for many, many years, and I read about the allegations in this case, and my jaw kind of drops. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that stuff's happening. And I'm somebody who I think of as having pretty thick skin with this. It's really shocking. It's hard to hear about. I imagine what the defense is really going to harp on throughout the case, but particularly when it comes to closing, is this idea that, the jurors can hate Combs. They can find this lifestyle disgusting.
Then came witnesses, friends who saw things, assistants who kept quiet, a former stylist who remembered Cassie showing up to a shoot shaking. They corroborated everything. Not just one-off stories, but a consistent pattern. A system of emotional and physical domination. Legal analysts watching the case said this wasn't just a slam dunk. It was historic. Because Cassie wasn't just telling her story. She was tearing down a fortress, a cultural icon's wall of silence. Diddy's team tried to fight back. Said she stayed because she wanted fame, that she's bitter. But it didn't land. The narrative was too strong, too true, too deeply rooted in the timeline of their history. And it got worse. Cassie revealed she had kept a diary, every entry dated, backed up, protected by legal counsel. She read one entry from 2017. Today, he said I'd never leave him alive. I smiled and said okay, but inside I was already planning. The room gasped. Diddy didn't move. He sat like a statue, jaw clenched, one hand over his mouth, occasionally whispering to his lawyer. But it was over. You could see it on his face. The panic wasn't loud. It was quiet, deep. Real.
The Combs was violent, and he had been told that Combs had had other people killed. The defense is adamant it's highly prejudicial against Combs, but the government says they're just trying to get him to talk about his safety concerns that he had at the end of his relationship with Cassie. Ultimately, the judge decided that Emily Johnson must move on from this type of questioning. The testimony of Kid Cudi ended with him telling the jury that he believed that Sean Combs lied to him. So what was it like in the courtroom when Kid Cudi was testifying? Elizabeth Milner with Law and Crime was there. So Elizabeth, were the jurors, did it seem like they knew who Kid Cudi was when he walked in and took the stand?
Yeah, it didn't seem that way from what I could tell, but I feel like from everyone in the gallery, they were there and they were ready to see Kid Cudi, see him walk inside that courtroom. It felt kind of like a movie moment a little bit where everyone's turned around and then all of a sudden he just walks across to the witness stand, takes his seat, does the oath, all that. But, him coming in, he was super casual. He had a motorcycle jacket. He had a white T-shirt on. Even like from other witnesses that I could see testifying, they're always in suits. They're in more professional type of wear and that thing. But as far as Kid Cudi is concerned, yeah, motorcycle jacket, his earring, his jeans, just walked up to the stand pretty casual. I didn't see the cigarette smoking or anything like that. But, when he was on the stand, he was very casual even throughout. He just seemed like he was just there to kind of speak his piece, say his part, and then just kind of move on from it. And he seemed like he was just kind of just ready to get this part over with for sure. Mm-hmm.
And he seemed like he was a little bit of a charmer, actually, on the stand. And I'm getting that just from the transcripts, because it sounds like he was just authentic. He was just him. And there were some laughs, from what I understand, in the courtroom from some of his testimony, even though this is not a laughing matter. Tell me what happened with the laughing.
Yeah, so he had some interesting one-liners when he was on the stand testifying, a lot during the direct. So one of the big things was just his reaction to his car being blown up with a Molotov cocktail. And
AUSA, what the F?
Yeah, they were AUSA Emily Johnson was just like, what was your reaction to everything? And then he just can't.
Outside the courtroom, the world erupted. News vans packed the street. Protesters chanted. Social media flooded with support. Celebrities distanced themselves. Some released statements. Others deleted old photos. Hashtags trended for days. Cassie testifies, surviving Diddy, Diddy exposed. And it didn't stop there. Other women began to come forward. Anonymous tips, leaks, claims that Diddy's abuse wasn't isolated, that the same patterns showed up in other relationships. One former assistant said she's been waiting 10 years for this moment. Said she cried watching Cassie on the stand. The prosecution ramped up. More subpoenas, more documents, whispers of hidden footage, security tapes from his mansions. A former bodyguard even hinted he'd testify next. Said there's a room in one of Diddy's properties where secrets are buried, literally and digitally. Cassie's testimony was just the beginning, but it cracked the dam. What we're watching isn't just a fall from grace, it's a collapse. The unmaking of a mogul.
Cassie testified that Combs made the threat directly to blow up the car. Maybe we expected a kind of a mob-style explosion, but arson doesn't require that, right? A Molotov cocktail in your porch that burns it is enough. And the reason I like this is obviously the defense got out that, it wasn't definitively tied to Combs and that the DNA in the vehicle was a female's. Right. But I think there's enough circumstantial evidence, given the threat and the timing, for the jurors to believe that it was Combs. And I like these types of predicate acts because it allows the prosecution to somehow potentially get to racketeering without proving sex trafficking. I think they've proven sex trafficking, but let's say the jurors think that this was all consensual, the freak-offs. You have arson, you have extortion, you have blackmail, you have kidnapping, you have other potential activities that can get you that pattern of racketeering without sex trafficking.
So I want to break that down a little bit, and we're going to get to that, but you made two good points there. On cross-examination, Brian Steele, got out that, there was female DNA that they tested for in the car. So, we don't know that Combs's DNA was ever linked to this. He's accused of running a criminal enterprise. So it's not like he would have gotten his hands dirty and done this himself. He would have had somebody else do it, possibly. But they didn't explicitly tie it to Combs, but Combs apparently said a couple years later, hey man, I'm sorry about all that. That was my girl. I thought we were homies. So he kind of apologized for it. But then Brian Steele also brings up this whole thing about, Cassie playing Kid Cudi. He felt that she had played him. And that I think could be very powerful for the jury. Don't you think that could be powerful for the jury? Because it goes to possibly, as you brought up, you don't think they've proven sex trafficking, but it could go to this whole thing about Cassie, the defense argument that she's an opportunist.
Yeah, I think the government has proven sex trafficking, but I know people watching, some of them don't believe they have. But you're right, Anjanette. Brian Steele's one of the best. I mean, obviously, we covered him for many months on the Young Thug case. It seems like a never-ending trial. And so the fact that he was added to the team to cross-examine this witness really shows how good he is. I agree with you. I thought he got 3 very good points out. The first is with respect to the arson, that really there's no direct evidence tying Diddy to it. Maybe the threat and the apology years later. I also thought that there was good evidence that Cassie might have talked about physical harm that she suffered by Combs, but she never mentioned any sexual assault or sexual abuse. That was a very important point that came out during cross. And then, like you said, the fact that Cassie was playing both of them, I thought that was a good point that came out as well. Maybe she wasn't the victim that she's saying that she is.
The deconstruction of a legacy built not just on music and money, but fear and silence. Diddy lost more than a case. He lost control. And once that's gone, there's no rebuilding it. This isn't just about Cassie anymore. It's about every voice that was silenced, every contract that was weaponized, every person who thought they had no choice. The truth is out. The secrets are unraveling, and Diddy's empire is crumbling in front of the world. The courtroom isn't done. The trial isn't over. But the shift has happened. The scales have tipped. And what comes next could be even darker. Because when survivors speak, the powerful fall. And now, the reckoning has truly begun.